Well, good morning. I'm with James Arnold. It's March 23rd, 2012, and we're in New York City. And welcome, Mr. Arnold. I'd like to start out with you talking a little bit about how life's path got you to where you are today, the CEO of your own consulting group, Arnold Consulting Group. So just talk a little bit about that. How did you get here?
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thanks a lot for inviting me to be here. Well, I started off to be an English lit professor, and along the way I got sidetracked. I had an assistantship and teaching assistantship at Vanderbilt in the graduate school on English lit, and while I was there I began doing historical research, another love of mine, for the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home on the outskirts of Nashville. And I had the good fortune to publish a number of articles, and it was an exciting thing for me because I had direct access to Jackson's papers. I could actually sit in his office, go through his notes, go through his papers. He even had a traveling liquor cabinet that we put in the coach that he was riding in. And I could open that, and one day I found myself sniffing his brandy bottle to see if I could smell any brandy in there. And so clearly I was excited by the physical proximity and the actual authenticity of looking at those documents. And I found that at that time, which is before the National Endowment for the Humanities had come along and nurtured all of these kinds of things, that there was a lot of really good, rich, textured things to be found and written about. And I wrote about a number of them, and as a result of that, I ended up never really completing my academic cycle, always going to finish that dissertation and get it done. But I was writing and doing something else that I like. That brought me into the circle of a man named John Siegenthaler, who was the editor of the Tennessean at that time, later the publisher, and then eventually the first editor of USA Today after Gannett bought the Tennessean. And he was a lover of history, and he read some of the things I wrote, and he began to ask me to write stuff for the Sunday magazine of the Tennessean, and I would. And then I ended up having a gig on the noon show there, which was a television show on the NBC affiliate on Middle Tennessee history, and I would go on and do a walkabout and tell people about things that were of interest. And as a result of doing that, kind of out of the blue, in 1966, when I was still in graduate school, not yet out, I was asked to work on a gubernatorial campaign that Mr. Siegenthaler had a big interest in Tennessee. And I did. I became an issues writer. I did a lot of the issues research. Our candidate lost, but he lost in the primary. So in '68, when Robert Kennedy decided to run for president, John Siegenthaler had been Robert Kennedy's press secretary. And he asked me if I wanted to go to Northern California and handle media in Northern California for Kennedy. And I said, sure. I mean, I was all of 26 or 27 and had never really handled anything like that, but I thought, how hard could it be? And while there, I got to know Jess Unruh, who was at that time the chairman of the Kennedy campaign for the state of California, former Speaker of the Assembly. Later, after losing to Ronald Reagan, became the treasurer of the state, but was kind of a legendary character and a political figure. He was running the campaign, and I ended up being attached to him. He was my boss in that part of California. So I became very involved in political activities in the Democratic Party, and of course the Kennedy campaign ended very sadly. I went back to Tennessee, kept on doing research, and soon another campaign came along in 1970, same candidate for governor, so I worked again, we lost again. This time everybody lost. The real Al Gore, as we call him, was Al Gore Jr.'s father. Al Gore Sr. lost to a Republican from East Tennessee, and Howard Baker had already been elected to the Senate, taking Estes Kefauver's seat. My candidate for governor lost, so we had in Tennessee, for the first time since Reconstruction, a Republican governor, and we also had 2 Republican United States senators. So I was a little bit at loose ends, and Tennessee is an oddity of the states. It's the only state where the president of the Senate of the state is also the lieutenant governor under the Constitution. So you're a real senator. You have a vote, you have appointing powers and everything, as the president of the Senate does in most states. But in Tennessee, you're automatically made the lieutenant governor. So I got a call one day from this man whom I barely knew, who said, I'm thinking about running for governor, and he was then the lieutenant governor, the highest ranking Democrat left in statewide office. And he said, would you like to work for me on my staff and we can develop a plan? I did. I organized political campaigns for the legislature. We had in '72 an unfortunate nomination at the federal level when McGovern ran in Tennessee. George Wallace actually won the Democratic primary. So we had to organize legislative campaigns to outside the traditional lines of the Democratic Party. So we created an organization to do that. I ran that organization. We kept control of the legislature, but the Democratic Party in the state lost a lot of seats and was pretty well decimated. In short order, I was elected president of the Young Democrats of Tennessee, and I became the official unpaid executive director of the Democratic Party. And my job in that was to put together a campaign for someone who could regain one of the Senate seats. And I did that. That man's name was Jim Sasser, and he became senator from Tennessee shortly thereafter. My boss said to me, I don't want to run for governor. I've changed my mind. I'm going to support someone else. I was getting a divorce. Jess Unruh called me out of the blue and said, we have founded a national organization whose mission is to improve state legislatures, and it's private sector based. It has a few legislators involved, but most of the people come from organized labor or from Common Cause, or they come from the League of Women Voters. They're academicians, they're newspaper people. Would you like to talk to us about working for us? And I said, sure, why not? I'm available. Interestingly enough, they had a terrific job, and now I'll hit the road. The job was that they had received grant number 3 from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And that grant was to create in 10 states what was called a Model Committee Staff Project in Health. These would be 10 states that had no history of using professional staff in the legislature. So they were really dependent on the executive branch of the government for information. And they were states where traditionally the legislature was viewed as kind of like the board of directors, and the governor was the CEO, and the CEO kind of proposed and the legislature disposed. And it was a rubber stamp, is the term often used. And we picked those 10 states on purpose because we wanted a demonstration that would be real. Not to go to a state like Illinois or California or New York that already had staff and a long history of having staff, but to really go to states where there was a clear agenda, where there were health issues, public health issues in the state that needed to be addressed. And this was a terrific program. I was hired to be its manager. I had a staff of 20 people in 10 state capitals. And out of this program, we passed the first HMO enabling legislation in the country in 9 of those states. We passed the first EMS legislation, creating statewide EMS systems, and a whole host of other very innovative certificate of need legislation, area health education center legislation. All of those things are very important at the state level. And the purpose of this project, of course, was to try to demonstrate to people that the legislature could do much more to fulfill its equal branch, as it were, to the executive or to the judicial in terms of making policy in the states. I mean, legislatures, after all, are the place where they grant you your birth decree and your death certificate. So from the day you're born till the day you die, states do a lot to control the quality of life for people who live there. I rose through the ranks of this organization, became its executive director, and at one time was leading a staff of people who were working in 30 different states. We were working on alcoholism, on drug abuse, on juvenile justice issues. Our mission was not to lobby a state, but was to give them the professional tools. They selected the staff ultimately. We pre-qualified them. They worked for them, but they had to agree to certain process improvements in the way the legislature worked. Both the minority and the majority party had to sign the contract. They had to work as joint committees, not as separate committees, working at cross purposes with each other. They had to have citizen involvement. They had to have hearings, and we had to be able to see all of that. I got very interested then in sort of the cause of, I guess the best way to say it's legislative improvement. That was my first big philosophical undertaking, was to try to convince people that how the laws get made are as important as what laws get made, because that process affects all the laws. And if one interest group can somehow or the other steamroll a legislative body to get legislation passed, 2 years later another interest group can steamroll it back the other way. Something that will be important when I talk about one of my largest clients later on in the National Congress. So after a period of time, funding began to change for organizations like this one. The Congress passed much stricter tax laws so that where we used to get a lot of soft money from the Ford Foundation or from Carnegie, as opposed to grant-specific money, dried up. And in addition to that, we had a contract from Ford to try to merge the three significant membership organizations made up of from the legislatures themselves. There was a leaders organization, there was a rank and file member organization, and then there was a staff organization for all 50 of the state legislatures. And our contract was to merge them all into what today is the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL, which is the trade association for America's 50 legislatures. Once we had finished that contract, we decided, the board did, I think using very good judgment, to go out of business. Unruh, I think, said it best. He said, you know, we used to say that the legislatures of America were the sleeping 800-pound gorilla, and our job was to wake them up. And he said, but now that I look back on it, I think the further job remaining is who's going to civilize them now? Now that they're awake, how are we going to civilize them? I decided then to become a consultant, and the industries that are most regulated at the state level are those that are clearly at hand: alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and insurance. And I had developed fairly good relationships with some of the professional organizations who were involved in the regulation of insurance at the state level, and one of them wanted to create in the 10 federal regions, they wanted to create a public affairs capability. They wanted to put public relations people there to work with their lobbyists in a way to shape public opinion with regard to the environment in which decisions were made about state-regulated insurance. So they gave me my first contract as a consultant, and I organized the public affairs program for the Alliance of Insurers. And as a result of doing that, it's funny, I've had good fortune in this way. The other two trade associations, there were the stock companies, the mutual companies, and then the independent companies. They all used more or less what are called the independent agents to sell their insurance. And those are small family businesses usually with the big I. Their problem was that they were losing market share to what are called the direct writers, where the sales force is actually employed by the insurance carrier itself. And the reason this was important is because the marketplace in which insurance was being sold, property casualty insurance we're speaking of specifically, which has great societal consequences. The issues of redlining, for instance, grow out of property casualty insurance, as does gender-based rating for automobile insurance grew out of that industry. So there are a lot of societal dimensions to what they do and to the way they do their business. They were concerned because as their market was changing, there were these undercurrents of unrest, and it was sometimes important in states out west in particular to have to run a campaign. Somebody would put on the ballot an issue instructing the commissioner of insurance in their state to change the way automobile risks were rated, to eliminate gender bias in it at all. And so the companies would have to decide then, are we going to fight that, or are we going to go along with that? What should be our decision? But what was changing it most was technology. Increasingly, the companies wanted to sell more than just insurance. They wanted to be able to sell financial services. They wanted to be a financial services company. That's why today you will find Prudential, for instance, one of my earliest clients used to be Prudential Property and Casualty, and today the entire company is just called Prudential Financial Services. That marketplace was changing. So they wanted somebody to devise a plan that would keep the independent insurance agents strong and help them to recover market share. And I gave them a proposal to do that, which basically was to run an integrated advertising and public relations campaign across all the 50 states. I raised the funding from the carriers, about $25 million pledged by the carriers, and then the independent agents themselves pledged another $5 million. So we had $30 million to start with. I came to New York, hired an agency, picked a spokesperson. The spokesperson was Raymond Burr, who's his first client product that he'd ever endorsed, and we used his image, obviously, both as Ironsides and as Perry Mason in the advertising. And I wrote the tagline that was used, the more than one company agent, to try to play up the credibility of the independent agents. During that time, I got to know Chester Berger. I had met Chet before at a program for the insurance industry at which he was a speaker. We become friendly with each other, and I needed a place to work while I was in New York. And in fairly short order, Chet reorganized my priorities. I began using his office, and then he asked me, he kept saying, well, what will you do when Perry Mason is through? I mean, you can only do Perry Mason for so long. And I knew he was right about that, because what I discovered is that I have a genuine love for, I guess, the pursuit of new business, the pursuit of a project, the pursuit of a challenge. I was good at building up an organization. I was good at finding grantors to support it. I'm good at recruiting people, good at selling an idea. But I wasn't so good at just doing the routine maintenance of stuff, you know, month after month or year after year. And I knew he was right, because I was becoming rather bored of it. You know, for one thing, I learned how large the ego of somebody like Raymond Burr can be. And when you have to worry about whether or not the scotch bottles in his room are the right size or not, after a while you start thinking, you know, I think there must be a more sane way to make a living than this. And so I had a contract. I wasn't an employee of the organization, and in time I just let the contract go, and I pursued a contract with the lodging industry, who were interested in what amounted to, built around Memorial Day, National Vacation Week, to promote travel. And so I stayed in Chet's office, and I put that program together, and it was fun when I just assembled the resources, got the ideas going, actually got a proclamation out of the White House and through the Congress, you know, to make this National Travel Week. I think it's Travel Month now, I think. And Chet and I became good friends, and he began to ask me if I wanted to work on a project, help him with a project. And I did. I learned a lot from him, and I enjoyed the association a lot. In time, I became a partner in his firm, and then as he anticipated retirement, he asked me to take over as the CEO of the company, and I did so, and eventually I bought out his interest in the business, and he left. And so that would have been in 1991 when I changed the name of the company at his insistence, in fact, from Chester Berger and Company to Arnold Consulting. Since he was not going to be remaining in the business but was of counsel, he said he really didn't want to have his name, I guess, just existing and in perpetuity in a business that he wasn't responsible for. And his very good advice to me was, and he said, besides that, you're selling yourself. And he said, you know, you shouldn't be selling yourself using my name on the door. You really need to put your name on the door and do it that way. And that's the story of how I got to be, at least through 1991, and I've continued to do pretty much the same thing. We built Arnold Consulting Group up. At one time I had around 30 people, all of them senior consultants in the same way that Chet had always done it. He never wanted to bring anybody to work on a client who hadn't had a lot of time in place and had basically been there and done that, because what he wanted to sell for a client was that we hear you, we understand what you're dealing with, we've dealt with it before, we understand it, and our people will help you solve your problem. And his way of doing that was to always listen well to what the client said, and then assemble a team of people from within the organization that had relevant experience, and then wait for the light bulb to go off, which always was. He was not big on promoting. So he didn't, his idea wasn't that you get the client in the room and then you beat up on the client by how great your people are and who all you've done this for. He's much more the kind of person who would say, as he always did in his proposals, at the end of the proposal, but why take our word for it? Here are a list of people we've done similar work for. And while we don't usually disclose who our clients are, I have their permission in this case to use their names, and feel free to speak with them and ask how we did, whether or not we helped them. And he was always after us, never to be self-promotional. Whenever, if you had a meeting around the table to discuss a client's needs, which is usually called a request for qualifications meeting, when they say, how are you qualified to help me? Chet would always take the lead, but he was always very controlling about not letting somebody start saying, oh, well, I've done that before. We know how to do that. Here's who we've done that for. Chet would always say, well, I seem to hear you saying that you have a problem about getting your senior management's attention. And Jim, you've had some experience with that, haven't you? How would you handle this? And that way he would keep you from starting to be self-aggrandizing or self-promotional, which he didn't want, because he felt it was a turnoff to clients. And he put that in virtually everything he did, and this all became very formative to me because it directed really the way I thought about how to do a business. In Chet's world, you began every letter with the word you. It had to be the subject, the first sentence in the letter, because he wanted us always to have the you perspective of the client or the person you're writing to. And I think rightly so. He would say, if you have to write the first sentence and you as the subject of the first sentence, then you have to say something in the first sentence that will be of value to the you that you're writing to. And he would say, that's what I want you to do. And all of his materials, whatever brochures that he had or anything, rather than going through the material and saying, our mission, our purpose, our clients, our people, he would always say, we don't want to say anything like that. This is not a brochure about us. This is a brochure about how we can help you. So if anything, it should say clients we have served, not our clients. And that helped really to shape my view about what a consultant does. Now, the business I'm in and the business that Chet was in is very different from what a public relations agency or a firm or an advertising agency would do. We don't represent clients in a public forum. We're not their advocate in a public forum. We work, in fact, internal to the organization that we're working with the top management of the organization to help them do the three things that management consultants do, which is to devise a strategy, to put the right structure in place to carry out the strategy, and then put the right systems there to support the structure and the strategy. So for us, this means deciding what the problem or the problems are that the organization faces, what the best strategy is to meet that problem. Sometimes it involves changing the people. Sometimes it involves realigning the people. Sometimes it involves the fact that what the communications people are doing is not related to the business of the organization. That's a little bit scary. One of the things that I noticed in working with Chet was that Chet was very good at getting people to talk about what was on their mind. And he had a very effective way of doing this with the CEO. He would always ask them to say, well, tell me a little about your business. How do you make your money? And he had always very carefully researched the company. He never went in anywhere without having done all of his homework. And he would have a reason for doing this. And he might say, but now, wasn't there a problem with the plant that you have in Niagara Falls? Didn't I read once that you had a problem there? And he would get them talking about this, and then he would say, and then what? Now, how did the PR people handle that? He would ask in that way to get them to talk more, because what he wanted to do was to have them feel like, first of all, this was somebody who listens and pays attention and is interested in me and what I need and what I want. And he always tried to put it into the best, most positive construct that he could. And maybe the second new business call I ever went on with Chet was to Firestone Tire and Rubber. And Firestone had a new CEO, and the CEO had come out of the automobile industry because Firestone's basic clients were the big three in Detroit and then the US government for selling their tires. And they didn't deal with the public very much. And this was the kind of assignment Chet liked. The new CEO, a man named John Nevin, decided he wanted to get into the aftercare market with cars. And for him, that meant he wanted to buy a chain of existing auto service centers that had been had been owned at that time by the J.C. Penney company, and J.C. Penney wanted to get rid of them. So there were 1,700 of these service centers around, whereas the Firestones were all dealer franchises, the existing Firestone stores. And the Firestone stores just depended on Firestone promotion to drive business to them. So now suddenly he owns a chain of what amount to retail outlets, and Firestone had not been a retail company. And he's very unhappy with the way things are going. And so as he describes to us his problems, it turns out he's a former journalist. And one of his problems was, he says, nobody in this place can write. And he said, they send me stuff up here that if in Philco, when I was running Philco for Ford, he said, if somebody had sent something like that to my desk, I would have written a note across it that said, "You're fired," and sent it back to them. And he said, I don't think anybody down there can write. I also don't think they can proof. And he said, I need help here. And he said, so the first thing I'd like you to do is figure out, am I right or wrong? Can these people write and I just don't know it? Or what? I don't think they know what kind of, what to expect out of me. And of course that was true. The people who were there had been in place a long time. They were terrified of the new CEO. And they didn't get any direct feedback from him. They didn't know why. He just wouldn't use the stuff they sent them. And so they weren't communicating with each other. We spent time talking to them, and then Chet came back up and he said to Mr. Nevin before we left, well, I think we can help you. I've spent some time talking to the people in your public relations shop, and he said, and I think we can help you. And he said, but it's going to be, it may result in some dislocation of resources and some changes. If that's all right with you, I'd like to send you a proposal. Mr. Nevin said, that'll be fine. And Chet said, but let me ask you one thing. He said, before I go, because I always like to find something positive. Is there anything that the public relations people do that you like, that you approve of? I'd like to know what that is. Mr. Nevin thinks about this for a minute, and he finally says, if I'm going to be making a speech, or if I'm going to have a press conference or anything, they always have a glass of water up there on the podium for me, and it doesn't have any ice in it. And he said, that's just the way I like it. And he said, that's good. So as we were leaving, Chet said, I'm going to have a real problem with this one. He said, I don't know that he really knows what it is he wants out of the public relations department. He sees them as a bunch of writers, and he doesn't like the way they write. And the thing he does like is that they meet his personal need to have a glass of water. Here's a guy who his expectations are much too small for what he should be getting, and he doesn't know how to use them. And of course he was right. As we got into the case, it became clear that what had happened here, as we would all see quickly today, is that this company had reinvented itself when it bought the 1,700 auto service centers and tried to morph them into the already existing brand. It was basically an original equipment manufacturer that suddenly had a consumer-based business. But nobody had explained any of that to the communications people, nor did they know they were supposed to be doing anything any differently. Mostly they worried about 3 or 4 magazines, and they sponsored the Firestone 500, and they carried on car activities, golf tournaments and so on. And that's what they had been expected of them in the past. So Mr. Evans didn't know how to explain his changed expectations. They didn't know how to read the tea leaves. And it was really a case of my watching Chet sort of do his alchemy in this, which was to basically in time propose that a special position be created for the person who had been running corporate public relations, that they recruit someone who had the background and the skills to be able to deal with the retail side of the business, and they would have to therefore rebuild the staff in the organization. Well, I learned a lot just from working with him on that case, and I can say that as I continued to work with him throughout really the 80s, I continued to learn, but most of all, I think I just learned again and again and again how important were the principles that he operated on and the way he saw things, functioning and focusing. So I've enjoyed a good experience and a good career in this, and it's given me a chance really to, I know, make a difference in some very big companies and some large organizations by simply learning to listen, being very good at identifying problems, trusting my intuition sometimes, and always remembering, I think the most important sort of rule of Chester Berger is that nobody is going to pay you a lot of money to tell them what they're doing wrong. They already know they're doing something wrong, and mostly they have bits and pieces of what it is, but no, they know it's not working. And if you feel like your mission is to get all self-righteous and start lecturing them or telling them how wrong all of this is or how bad all of this is, you're going to turn them off. And he said, my goal always is to make a change. My goal is to have something be better after I've been involved there, and I know a part of that is psychology. And it's not by making people feel inadequate or off the track as much as it is by getting to the meat of it, which is, but what can we do about this? Then what can we do to improve this? And making concrete suggestions. Chet's reports and things, the recommendations would be the beginning of the report. And then what consultants call the verbatims, the excerpts from interviews and the findings that we got would be almost like an appendix at the back, because he didn't want to begin a review of a project by digging into everything that was wrong. So that became my guiding light as well. I would always look to say then, what are we doing here that's good, but now what could be done better? What could we do to improve it?
But one of the questions that I had was, who had the most significant influence in your life? And I think obviously Chester Berger was a tremendous influence in your life, in your whole attitude toward work and your relationships with people. So mentoring was very, very important. Have you followed suit in that at all? Have you felt that you've been a good mentor to others?
Oh, I do. I think that's a large part of running a good consulting business is that you have to have a mentor relationship with the people that you work with because it's a part of creating the culture inside of the shop. And sometimes this means that you can't keep someone. In one case, I had a person that was, if anything, overeducated. It's someone with a PhD in English Lit and also with an MBA from the Kellogg School, and a very, very bright person, but impulsive and driven to be able to explain to the client what they're doing is wrong and why it's wrong. Rather, when you begin a project, the first thing you have to do is you have to learn. So I call it a process of discovery. And this is one of the things I try to get people in mentoring to understand is that from 35,000 feet, all companies look alike. It's not until you've run deep inside the company for a while and until you can say how this company is different from its competitive set or its peer groups or its industry. Until you can say specifically how it's different, you're not ready to give anybody any advice yet. You have to know the company that well. You have to understand the authenticity of what the company is so that you then can provide advice and recommendations basically using their own language and using their own examples. and showing the benefits that that come from that. So it's that bit about starting off with I like to just call it modesty. I think a good consultant is modest up front about saying, no, I don't know everything about your company yet. And sometimes in the selling in campaign that you do to get a client, this is very difficult because you always meet, particularly in CEOs, the people who want snap, 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 snap. And so you get the guy who takes you to lunch at the Harvard Club and wants to tell you very quickly, well, all right, now here's what I think my problem is. Now what should we do about it? And you have to say, well, just like a good doctor, I've learned that sometimes the apparent symptoms don't really bespeak whatever the underlying illness may be. And I'm not going to really jump to a conclusion like that. It wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't be honest, and it wouldn't be right. And sometimes you go so far as to say, it sounds to me like you've made up your mind that somebody should be canned. And maybe you're just looking for me to come along and paper over that decision. And I don't want to, I don't want to get involved in something like that. It's just not professionally an honest, an honest thing to do. But having, for an organization, having a process the way you do your business, which is what Chet had in his place. He had a very clearly laid out way that he wanted to get a client, how he wanted to serve them, and what he hoped then would be a good reference from that. And I find those same things are important in the people that you work with in your own business, and you have to mentor people into that. And not everybody fits. Some people don't, and you just have to say, this is probably not the kind of business you should be in. As consultants, we often don't even disclose who our clients are. They don't want us to, for whatever reason. And so it's not the thing you do because you're going to see your name in the newspaper necessarily, or you're going to be associated with a high-profile client the way that a public relations agency may be. That was a tough thing for me to get around because I made the mistake of hiring, in some cases, 2 or 3 people with high-profile agency experience who came into the business but were just not good as consultants. To be a good consultant, you also have to be kind of a teacher. You have to be persuasive. You have to get people to be willing to try what your recommendations are, and they have to believe in them. They have to believe that they're credible. One of the important lessons I got from Chet about this, going back to the same Mr. Nevins at Firestone, when we were making a report to Mr. Nevins, and I'd written most of the report, and inside the report I had put in a couple of citations from management experts, Peter Drucker or someone, and Chet let it stay in, and we went through, and everything was fine. And as we were flying back to New York, Chet said to me, he said, I know you're just beginning now as a consultant, but he said, could I offer you a little advice? He would say, from now on, he said, just remember this. When you're working with me, you're the expert. You don't need Peter Drucker or anybody else. I don't want Mr. Nevins to think that he should have hired Peter Drucker. He said, I want you to be it. This is you. You've made the study. You're making the recommendations. You don't need to borrow from somebody else their credibility. Use your own credibility. And I probably will never forget that until my dying day because it hit me right between the eyes. And I've tried to pass that message on to everybody who's worked with me and to people who just ask my advice, is that in the consulting business, you are the product. Your credibility is on the line, and you have to defend your recommendations, and you have to defend your findings. And you don't want to do it in a defensive way. You want to be so thoroughly prepared and so confident that you figured out, what it is that you want to recommend. Because when we're involved with a client, we're really working at the policy-making level of that organization. People are sitting there saying, we have a public relations problem. Can you help us define it? Then can you tell us what the appropriate response to this is? And then how do we need to get organized to do that? How much money do we need to have to put behind this? What kind of a timetable? Is this a 5-year deal, a 2-year deal? What is it about that that's important? And you have to have a team of people with you who are specialists in employee communications or investor relations or public affairs or marketing communications, any of those things, who are experienced. I mean, they don't have to go in and start reciting off, all the things they've done, because they can speak to management in a way that sends them the message that says, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I've dealt with this before, and I can help you deal with it. And just as Chet had to, and did, I was very fortunate, passed on and shared with me these things. I've always thought about it as kind of like the chief of the tribe passes it on to the younger members of the tribe, the things you need to know, the respect for the earth and the sun and the moon and the stars, all of those things. Chet was like that, but he had just the perfect touch. He would never criticize you or belittle you. You knew Chet was about to give you some wisdom when he would say, "Could I just make a suggestion?" and you knew to pay attention. Right. That said, okay, listen up. It'll be good.
I'm sure we can both hear him in our brain.
Well, he obviously made a huge impression on me. I mean, I worked with him every day for so many years, and it was always a joy. For one thing, because the sorts of things that Chet got involved with were always the most interesting things going on, and that made you happy to be in that office. To do that. I mean, if I could just give you one little small aside about this. Chet, when he started his consulting business, nobody knew what a management consultant in communications was. And he had, from his television background, he had developed relationships at AT&T, and one person in particular who had sort of picked Chet's brain for a number of years but never paid him anything, was from AT&T, wanted to know about this new thing, television. What's it going to mean? How's it going to play out? And when Chet was on his own and doing this, he went to see this guy, and he said, I'm a management consultant in communications, and I'm here to help you. And so he says, well, nobody knows for sure what it is you do. I mean, what do you do? And Chet said, well, if you have a problem, if you're having a problem in communications, and maybe it's internal or maybe it's with some audience or something, I could help you analyze the problem and put together a plan. The guy says, I don't know about that, but he said, look, and he pushed across the table some folders, and he said, these are the bios of the officers of AT&T. I don't like the way they're written. Do you think you could help me rewrite them? Chet said, I very humbly picked up the folders and said, I'll certainly give it a try. And he left, and he said he was right. They were terrible. And he said, and I rewrote them, and he liked it, and he said, that was my first assignment at AT&T, for which I was paid anything, and out of that grew other things. And he said, I thought to myself, I guess a management consultant in communications does whatever it takes that the client wants to get a relationship going, because you have to make yourself useful to them first. Ultimately, you can become spiritually rewarding to them, but first of all, you have to be utilitarian. They have to see some immediate thing. They say, could you help me with this? And that's always been important to me. Chet, he became also very much involved with dealing with the principles of public relations firms. Chet had been really good at getting new business. His first job after he left CBS was working for Ritter Finn, and he just got in new business, and he would have a quota for the year, and he would bring it in. I think you have that in your video with him. And so after he started his own business, the principals of public relations firms would often call him and say, Chet, we're having a problem on developing a strategy. I mean, he would go and consult with them. And more, I think, is just a kind of a courtesy than anything else. And he'd send them a small bill. He'd go somewhere and have pizza and send them a bill for $75 or something, not much of anything. But as a result of that, interestingly enough, Chet got to know people who wanted to acquire public relations firms or people who wanted to sell their firm, and he became something of a deal maker. So one of the most venerable public relations firms during this period of time, which is the late 60s and early 70s, was called the Carl Bayer Company. Carl Bayer was a former newspaper man and a really good businessman who frankly never knew very much about public relations, but he knew what a public relations business should be like. And at one point, the company Foot Cone and Belding Advertising wanted to buy a public relations firm. And they had worked with Chet to try to see about starting their own public relations capability, decided that they didn't want to do that. They also tried to hire Chet to come in and do it, and he didn't want to do that either. So they asked him to acquire for them a public relations company. And so he managed to make a deal for the Carl Bayer Company, and Foot Cone and Belding took over the Carl Bayer Company. It didn't go so well. They were unhappy with it. So they said to Chet, what should we do? And he said, well, the good people at Carl Bayer unfortunately have left because they don't want to work for an advertising agency. I'm sorry to tell you this. You remember I warned you of this in the beginning. That might be a problem. And that public relations was the people, you know, and if they walk out the door, then what do you have that you've paid for? And they said, what should we do? And he said, well, perhaps I can find somebody to run it for you who doesn't mind working for a public relations company. And he did. And the person that he found was running another public relations firm in Boston, and so they ended up buying that public relations firm to get this person to come in and run the Bayer Company. A couple of years go by. Foot Cone and Belding says, we've decided we don't want to be in the public relations business anymore. We want you to sell Carl Bayer for us. We want to get rid of them. So Chet's talking to me about this, and he said, this is just kind of brilliant in a way, isn't it? And I said, what is? And he said, well, you know, Hill & Knowlton has now been, J. Walter Thompson, which owned Hill & Knowlton, has now been taken over by this fellow Martin Sorrell from England, who's taking over all of the big ad agencies, and he's getting their public relations arms. And he said, there's a new chap running Hill & Knowlton right now, and Hill & Knowlton slipped in the rankings last year down to second place. And he said, I'll bet you if I call this fellow and I say to him, I'll bet I could get Carl Bayer for you, that he'll go for it. And with me sitting there, he called up this person whose name, as they say, shall remain nameless, and said, I understand that Carl Bayer might be for sale. And he said, so I thought of you first, and I haven't mentioned this to anybody else yet. And over the speakerphone, this guy says, give me 24 hours, don't talk to anybody else about it, don't say a word about it. And 45 minutes later, he called back and he said, you think there's any wiggle room on a price? And Chet said, I haven't even asked him a price yet. And he said, don't talk to anybody else about it, we want it. We want to make this deal. So Chet makes the deal to sell Carl Bayer again, this time to Hill & Knowlton. In the meantime, two friends of Chet's who had a public relations firm in Washington had been working for Hill & Knowlton as like affiliates, and they weren't getting any business out of it, and Chet had arranged that relationship. And so he got him a divorce. He told Hill & Knowlton this before they bought Bayer. He said, these guys want to get out of the deal, they're not happy with it. They said, fine. So what Chet had done is he'd taken them over to Carl Bayer and said, these guys can work in your Washington office now, they'll be good for you. So here all that happened in the space of 3 days is that now Chet says to me, Jim, I think I have an assignment for you. And he said, it's going to be a bit of a nasty one. And he said, you're going to have to get on a plane, you're going to have to go down to Washington, and you're going to have to tell Messrs. So-and-so and so-and-so, who just now started working for Carl Bayer and quit Hill & Knowlton, that Hill & Knowlton just bought Carl Bayer, and that they now work for Carl Bayer again. Well, that was the kind of life being around Chet was. It was just, every day was just full of things at that kind of a level. I mean, the excitement in it, because he was trusted by so many people to come through, and so many people wanted his advice. They didn't all take his advice, sometimes to their regret, but they wanted his advice because he was truly seen as a wise man, a guy who gave good advice. Very exciting person to be around in the office, because the phone was always ringing, the people were always coming in, and it was never the same routine, dull stuff. It was always something very special.
Wonderful stories.
Well, we haven't talked much about Paige. I don't know if you want me to say.
Yes, if you could do a little bit about, yeah, okay. in the city.
Well, Chet was one of the original trustees of Page because of his AT&T relationship. And when Page first started, it was essentially an inside AT&T thing, which was very big. I mean, during those days, AT&T corporate public relations staff was over 1,700 people. You know, just at that time, Arthur Page was largely at that time an internal figure to people at AT&T. He wasn't that, you know, that well known. And in fact, in 1970, when there was a forced ranking by PRSA of 119 so-called famous people in public relations, and at that time, Page had barely been dead for 8 or 9 years, and he finished number 9 on the list. And everybody ahead of him, though, was the head of was the head of an agency. Not he was the first corporate person, but just wasn't known in the field particularly at all. So AT&T started off thinking this will just be kind of like retirees and current AT&T employees, and it'll just be to kind of keep this legacy alive. Chet was one of the people, I think, who helped turn their thinking away from this direction. He was, at that time, the only non-AT&T employee who was a trustee, although, as he points out, he was one of 2 people ever to have worked for AT&T who was in the Telephone Pioneers, which was the AT&T Retirees Association. He was elected as an honorary pioneer. And he argued that, you know, if you really want to make this something, that you've got to broaden it out eventually. But Chet was a trustee for only 2 years, and then he very generously said to me, I think, you know, I'm going to be wrapping up my affairs, and I think this is a great opportunity for you, and I think at this point they will accept you onto the board, even though I think there was maybe one other person at that time on the board who was not an AT&T, but they were heading in that direction. It was a very different organization. That was really sort of making it up as it went. You know, a lot of what it did was almost of a luncheon club variety. People get together, have a good time, share war stories, and encourage one another, and catch up on grandchildren and things of that sort. It was not very mission driven at the time, but over the next 4 to 5 years that I was involved, I came on the board in 1986. It really began to develop a mission. And I guess the easiest way to say it was that if you're thinking about dogs and you like dogs, the mission came to be, how do we improve the breed of person who is working in corporate communications? And mentoring became a large part of that. But there was also a sense of like, we need to get as big a tent as we can get here. So we need people from different industries and stuff, so that we can begin to pool our knowledge and our intelligence and our connections and find ways to set standards and enforce the standards. There was a period of time in which there was some concern about a kind of a deification of Page business, of like, well, why are we making Arthur Page out to be almost a godlike figure, you know, in doing this organization? And in fact, there was a contemporary of Page's named Paul Garrett, who was at General Motors, who was also extremely influential, and he actually had a more high-profile boss in Alfred P. Sloan to make him have a lot of impact. And both Page and Garrett were very active in, you know, they both were on the board at the Metropolitan, and they took turns chairing the publicity committee and on most of the other social service things in town. So they were friends, and they had a lot of influence on each other. I think the big difference ultimately was that Page, more than anybody else, had. Well, let me just say clearly that 2 of them were responsible for beginning to institutionalize public relations inside a corporation, as opposed to what, say, Ivy Lee or Eddie Bernays or Earl Newsom or Coral Byer would do, which was to keep public relations as a separate business using clients from the inside. So creating a role for public relations and then trying to integrate it into the organization was terrifically important. And the thing about Page and the way he did it that I think distinguished him more than any others, he was much pithier at describing why he would do things, in the way that he would do it. He also had a really good focus, I think, on what's important, and a lot of people attribute this to the fact that AT&T was a monopoly. I felt this as a principle, and that was that the public interest had to be uppermost in what you did in business, and thus his often quoted phrase about public permission and public approval. That is significant, but he believed that, and he used the word character, Page did, long before anyone else does. It's now a buzzword. I saw in yesterday's Times that the current CEO of Coca-Cola, Muhtar Kent, says that he believes now that customers are as interested in the content of our character as a company as they are in the content of the product that we make. I think that's true. I think the word character, maybe it combines reputation and brand and a whole other assimilation of attributes or qualities. But to me, the word character, which Page liked and used, and he used to say over and over again, we have to keep the character of AT&T open and available and transparent so that it shines through in everything we do. But whether it's a switchboard operator or the lineman or anybody else, they all have to participate in doing this. And I mean, he's often quoted as having said, it's a 10% saying and 90% doing. I think his idea of institutionalized public relations evolved beyond that, because he said that fairly early in his career. And you can see in reading through the speeches how his thinking evolved and became more sophisticated, but it was always anchored in this one thing, which was, and Page in his life, you will see his involvement with the government was always sincere and genuine. He always believed that ultimately the people's will would be done about any company, whether it was in the private sector or not, that if you lost the support of the public, then you ultimately would fail and your enterprise would fail, that it had to be there. Well, he's the first, I think, of the American business leaders who really understood that public opinion had been mobilized and organized with the emergence, particularly of the giant publishing companies, the newspaper companies, and of the radio companies. And he could anticipate what was going to happen with television, which would happen really in his own lifetime. But he understood how public opinion had become a significant force, and he also understood that it was the ultimate arbiter. It was the decider, because if a business got too far out of alignment with what people thought and valued, then they have a way of reining you in. But he wanted AT&T to, in a way, to keep itself open all the time so that people could see it, because he said, as the secret of being a monopoly is, you can't have secrets. People have to see what you're doing, because they have to always be reassured, A, that you're not using your monopoly just to enrich yourself, or that you're not being slothful just because you have a monopoly, or you're not being inefficient because you have a monopoly. Because, as he said over and over again, the one thing we managed to do was to get people to accept the fact that AT&T could be called a natural monopoly. We haven't overcome their suspicions of a monopoly, though, because that's still inherent in the American state of mind, is to be suspicious of anybody who doesn't have a competition. Well, all of those things fermented in a very yeasty-like way in the early days of the Page Society, because people could connect with, because those are very contemporary ways of thinking about a company and its use of public relations. The Page was also very, very insistent that the purpose of public relations, or as it was called, information in those days, was not only to make sure that the management's point of view was known to the public, but that the public's point of view was known to the management. That's very vital, because I think, particularly in the last 20 years or so, that more and more the managements of organizations, all organizations, have regarded public relations as being a microphone to broadcast out what they think, what they want to say, their story, their point of view, and less as a source of intelligence about what the public thinks and the outside environment. And I see this as being very critical for the success of any good public relations operation, and it's critical to the success of a public relations leader who wants to be a counselor, because somebody has to be the one, when you're getting it wrong, somebody has to be the one to go to the management and say, but the public isn't seeing this, that's not what they think. We're not getting across to them. And that may mean then that we have to change a policy, we have to change a procedure, we have to change a product, we have to change a service. We have to do something here, because ultimately in the collision between what the public expects of us and their lack of satisfaction with what we're doing now, they're going to win ultimately. And so it's up to us then as good stewards, and managers of the company, to try to anticipate where this is going. And I think some of Page's most interesting pieces had to do with anticipating where public opinion is heading and the changes that are coming. You just don't hear many people think about that very much today. One person did. And I think the person who's most informed by Arthur Page was Peter Drucker. Almost everything Drucker writes, first of all, in the concept of the corporation, which he did based on his work at General Motors, actually. And then secondly, in the Practice of Management, his 1954 book, is just highlights over and over again the views that Page had, and as well as the views that Garrett had about what public relations should do. Over and over again, Drucker emphasized this. I had the rare privilege of getting to know Peter Drucker and having visited with him on more than one occasion. Yeah. And having a lunch with Drucker once, I said to him, why do you think it is that public relations today doesn't have the same sort of automatic credibility or acceptance with the senior management team of that say it would at the time of Paul Garrett, and Paul Garrett actually hired Drucker to make the first study of General Motors, which became the concept of the corporation. Say of a Paul Garrett at General Motors or an Arthur Page at AT&T, and he said, as he got a little impish, and he said, well, because of my fellow countryman, Eddie Bernays. He said, Eddie Bernays taught everyone that public relations was about gimmicks. It was about coming up with some kind of a big idea like a celebration or a promotion or an anniversary that would attract the attention of the media. And he said the problem with that is if you're running a public relations firm, that's the way you can make a living. But if you're running a company, that's not what public relations has to be to the company. It can't be that. And he went on to say, which I thought was just remarkable, he said, what's happened here is because of Bernays, everybody thinks public relations is getting the word out, getting your story out, telling your story, pushing stuff out, pushing messages out, broadcasting messages. And he said, back in the original concept of public relations inside a company, almost quoting Page verbatim, without attribution, I might add, he said, public relations credibility comes from being able to advise management directly of what things will work and what things won't work based on the public's opinions and attitudes. And he said, you don't hear much of that anymore. And he said, so I'm going to take it then that the caliber of people doing public relations inside of corporations today is much less than it used to be at a time when there was an Arthur Page or Paul Garrett. And he said, I'm going to assume that they don't personally have the credibility or the stature with the management of their companies to be able to make this a part of their portfolio, such that they're going to be sitting there when people are saying, what should we do or what should we not do? They're going to be involved in the how do we say this or how do we explain this stage, not in the, well, what should we do stage. And I was struck by that, by his willingness to say that. But Page's business about the public interest was very critical to Drucker. If you look at the end of his book, The Practice of Management, on the last page of the book, he wraps it all up and he quotes an English pamphleteer from the Mandeville from the 19th century, who was a political economist, and that's different from an economist. But he wrote a satire called The Parable of the Bees. And in The Parable of the Bees, he had a philosophy which he expressed, which was the philosophy of a lot of political economists at the time, which was that private vices yield public virtues. So it's okay for people to do bad things because in the long run they cancel each other out and the public benefits to do that. Drucker ends his book by saying, in the democratic form of capitalism that we know today and is practiced in the United States of America, nothing could be further from the truth, because people have learned now that you have to conduct private business in the public interest. That's almost a Page statement. He was very influenced by Page and by what Page wrote and what Page said. And I think in that sense, it's been remarkable to look both at what Mr. Garrett did and what Mr. Page did and how ultimately they influenced Peter Drucker so heavily in his concept and his writings. And he's intimately familiar with both of them. They were, in fact, after Alfred Sloan left General Motors and Garrett was no longer working there, he and Drucker would have lunch at the University Club once a week and sort of commiserate about what was going on in the world of high finance in New York City. Absolutely fascinating stuff, and I think the Page Society has continued to expand and to grow to accomplish this mission. I think it's gone beyond just thinking of how to improve the breed. It's now trying to run real programs that will make consciously the effort to do that. I can't tell you how successful that's going to be as a strategy, because when I look back over the history of corporate public relations in particular, where I find that there have been real flowerings around, there was growth and there were high visible people. They were really people of top-notch quality. They were, and the question gets to be, can you mass produce people like that? It's like the age-old argument about leaders. Can you really make leaders? You can expose people to leadership skills and leadership strategies, but does that transform them into leaders? That's a real question. And I know, just to go back to Chet for a moment, Chet confessed to me one time late at night on a plane that I asked him, what's the most frequently asked question that you get from people, not necessarily clients, but people who come to you for advice and stuff? And he said, oh, without question, it's from people who are in positions in an organization and they want to be taken more seriously. And he said, I guess the easy way to say it is, how do I get more clout with the management? And he said, the disappointing thing is that I can explain to them how I think they should do that, and they will nod, and sometimes they'll take notes. And he said, but deep in my heart, I know that most of them are never going to have the kind of clout that they think they should have or that they want to have, because they simply don't have the aptitude, the personal skills to sync up and to get into their business. His favorite line about public relations people in management roles, Chet's, was that most of them think of themselves as public relations professionals first and not as business people or as corporate management. And he really didn't like the yuppie idea that you would hear people would say, I'm just a portable skills package. I can take myself and go anywhere and do public relations. It used to bother Chet immensely, because he would say, that's what's wrong. You see, they don't really get themselves rooted. A man like Arthur Page, he became central to the business of AT&T. He became central to the rationale for being a monopoly. He became central to the strategy of universal service throughout the Bell system. To the cross-subsidy between the long-distance lines and the local business. All of these things were Page's way of trying to show over and over and over again how AT&T had to put the public interest first, ahead of anything else. And Chet would say, to many of the people doing public relations, they think exactly that. They're thinking about, well, what's the next job I could get now where I can do public relations? They're not thinking about, how do I really integrate what I do into the fabric of this business? Make it vital, make it vitiating to the business itself. And that used to be very frustrating to him because he felt like in a way it was kind of insulting that somebody would come to him and say, as if there's some bag of tricks, that you've learned that you can just go plant these seeds and they'll grow into a beanstalk and it'll take you straight up to the top, to be successful. That stuck with me, and I think that's still a big challenge for Page, is trying to define what's the outcome, what's the end result of being involved in Page programs in terms of the impact on corporate management. Because from the very beginning, from day one I ever sat in a board meeting, there was no question that whether it was Ed Block or Jack Coton or Larry Foster or Marilyn Laurie who was talking, over and over again, the mantra was public relations is integrated into the senior management discipline of the organization. That's the goal, and that's what Page had done at AT&T. And that's why they chose the Page name, and that's why it was terrifically important. And I do know, because I know many people who are in Page now, that many of them they're not in that senior level. And whether or not Page ultimately can do much about that or not, I don't know. I guess that's the age-old question. But it's worth the try. I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm dismissive of it. Sure, it's worth the effort. But whether or not it will succeed in a high percentage of cases or not, I don't know. And thank you very much for asking.
Mr. Arnold, James Arnold, thank you very much for spending time with us today. You've shared some delightful stories, very interesting stories, and we very much appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Great.